and welcome to Strategies for Developing Online Learning. This webinar is part of the online P12 Teacher Series, Strategies that Support Virtual Teaching and Learning, brought to you by the School's First Center for Creativity and Critical Thinking at California State University, Fullerton. My name is Lindsay O'Neill. I am a full-time faculty member in the Master of Science in Instructional Design and Technology program at Cal State Fullerton. And today I'm just going to cover some strategies to help you develop effective and engaging lessons for your online learners. All right, so here's what we'll cover. We'll talk about using Robert Gagne's 9 events of instruction to teach online. I'll give you an example lesson that I planned out using Gagne's 9 events for an online course, and we'll go over specific strategies and tips for teaching online in a variety of formats. When it comes to teaching online, there's never just one format that you're using. You're often switching between modalities from asynchronous online lessons to synchronous Zoom webinars to students watching recorded videos. There's a lot out there, and so I'm going to cover a little bit of everything. Let's just quickly start with talking about how to teach for how people learn. If you're watching this, you are a teacher. You probably are very knowledgeable in this already. But as a quick recap, learning experiences are always going to be more effective when learners are active and engaged. And feedback, of course, is going to be critical to the learning process because a learner needs a chance to be able to correct any misunderstandings that they have to know if they're getting it right or not. So I do encourage you to make your learning social. Learners are always going to be more motivated and successful when social opportunities exist in an online learning situation. I encourage you to humanize your learning experience with instructor presence and empathy, and to give learners control and choices. It can make a big difference to an online learner. It can help them feel more connected to a class if they're able to make social connections with their classmates and with their instructor, and if the instructor has a really strong presence in the class, and also if they are able to have control and choices. It gives them a little bit more power in a situation in which they might not feel very powerful at all. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through this presentation. So let's start by chatting about Gagne's 9 events. So Robert Gagne was an educational psychologist that came up with 9 events of instruction. Altogether, they are the complete steps to basically any situation in which you're teaching something. So they are the complete steps to any lesson, an effective lesson. So as a teacher, you know that if someone's not paying attention, they are not learning. So Gagne posits the first step is to make sure your learners are paying attention. I'll talk a little more about these as I go through. Second is inform learners of objectives. So what are they going to learn? 3 would be stimulate recall of prior learning. Here, finally, we present the content they are which to learn. We start giving feedback by giving, well, actually not feedback per se, but learning guidance, giving some tips on how to learn, have them practice what they learn, provide feedback so they know if they learned it right, you assess their performance, and then enhance retention and transfer to the job. And the word job here can mean a literal job, or it can also mean that they're going to actually put this into whatever they learned into practice in the situation in which you want them to. So let's talk a little bit more about this. So as I said, and as you know, if someone's not paying attention, then they are not learning. So you can gain attention in a lesson by presenting some sort of a hook. This could be a story, it could be a game. I mean, this is the reason we use icebreakers quite frequently to make sure that your learners are kind of here, they're present, they're with you. There's a lot of ways to gain attention. It could be some sort of interesting fact from the lesson that you are about to cover. There's a lot of ways to do this, but it is important to make sure that you have their attention from the start, or you may not get the lesson started at all. It is important to inform learners of objectives. I mean, I would resist being really dry with this and just giving them a list of bullet points, but you can tell learners, like, today we're going to learn about the water cycle. You're going to learn how rain goes up into the clouds and comes down again. Okay, obviously I'm not a scientist. That is a terrible example. I'm not going to teach the water cycle anytime soon. But it is important for learners to know what they're going to learn so they can kind of like set their minds to be ready to kind of incorporate whatever they're going to learn into their existing knowledge. And again, they do have existing knowledge. This is kind of a cognitivist model that kind of positions your learners as, complete people that have lived experience, that have existing knowledge. So it's important, if you can, to stimulate recall of what they already know. So, I mean, like, for example, my terrible science example, they know what rain is, they know what comes from the clouds, they know when it's humid, so you might try to make connections to what they already know and what they've experienced to try to get them ready to incorporate new knowledge into what they already know. Next, it's really simple. You just present the content. I mean, that could be a video, it could be a reading, it could be something where they're doing research in the textbook. There's a lot of different ways to do this, but it's pretty static. All right, so next is you're getting them ready to practice to show what they know, okay? So you want to give people opportunities to practice what they're learning to make sure if they got it right or not. So it's important to provide some sort of learning guidance where you might address any sort of misconceptions that come up commonly. You might be walking them through an assignment you want them to do, and then you have them actually do it. This is the practice part. So say you have the content, they've done some reading, they're interested in the topic, and then you have them do some sort of assignment related to it. So this is the actual work part where they show you what they know or what they think they know. So again, this is the opportunity to kind of address any misconceptions where you provide feedback. If they have a misunderstanding, you correct that. If they've got it all correct, you just reinforce that. And then you move on to the final performance. I know this is very, very job-like and training-like in its guidance here, but the idea is you walk through this whole cycle, you give them a chance to practice, and then you give them a chance to correct what they already know, and then you do the final assessment. And then you can enhance retention and transfer to the job. And again, that's just not necessarily an actual job, but it could be like if they learn something about the water cycle, they're going to use that knowledge in a future module, maybe about climate change or about geography. So you kind of start to prepare them to reuse this knowledge someplace else. So at the very beginning of this series of steps, you prep them to incorporate this new knowledge into what they already know, and now you're going to prepare them to reuse this in a future situation. So again, job is used very liberally here. If you look up videos of the 9 events of instruction, I was first introduced to this topic with a video demonstrating to military police how to handcuff somebody. It's a very good example because it's very clear cut. It's very clear cut if you got it correct or not. So yeah, very job-like, but obviously for P12, you're not going to have an actual job. You're going to have a lesson, but think about how they might, retain this information and transfer it to future situations. All right, so I'm going to pause here for a second. I want to walk you through a quick example lesson of how I've used GAGNE'S 9 events in an online context. So I mentioned when I did at the beginning of this webinar, I did not mention that I teach entirely online in a master's program. It's a 2 years master's program. And we teach semester-long classes entirely online, mostly asynchronous, so students are working through things on their own. The class that I'm going to give you an example lesson from is IDT 540, Digital Design and Development. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about my lesson context here. It's always important to consider who your learners are. So here's who my learners are. I teach an instructional design program. I'm an instructional designer. I know what my learners kind of want to graduate and become post-graduation, or maybe they're already instructional designers as well, but they're trying to get the knowledge that kind of be able to speak the lingo to people. So that's my learners. Our course, this particular course, is a kind of more of a survey course in some ways. We survey a variety of topics. It's about digital design and development, so they get a bunch of topics related to help them become better designers and developers, and they put that into practice. And in this course, we spend a 2-week chunk of time on copyright and open multimedia, also known as open educational resources. So I did a 2-week lesson on this, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about as my example. All right. So as I designed this module, I started with thinking about what my goals were, and I can kind of converted those into learning objectives. So goals aren't things that you're necessarily going to measure whether or not your students have mastered, but they're things that kind of guide what you want your learning objectives to be. So my goals for my students as future instructional designers is to use copyrighted materials legally and to identify as contributors to the open community. Now, this also comes from my personal instructional philosophy as well. So your goals are probably going to also relate to your own instructional philosophy, depending on how much freedom, of course, you have to teach your subject. And then here are the learning objectives I came up with that fall under these goals. I won't go through all of them, but they're all specific and measurable and tied to items I have in this lesson. All right. So again, here's the GAGNE'S 9 events of instruction. I'm going to go through each of these in my lesson and tell you how I put them into practice in this online course. So first, you want to gain attention. So I'm really interested. I'm really interested in copyright. When you say the word copyright, a lot of people's minds turn off. But how I gained their attention into this fascinating subject was with a really interesting video by Adam Ruins Everything. If you haven't heard of Adam Ruins Everything, he does a really fun and also depressing series of videos because of course he's ruining stuff, and this one is how Mickey Mouse destroyed the public domain. So it's a really nice short sweet, I think it's like 4 or 5 minute video that's all about Mickey Mouse and how Disney has manipulated copyright law in the United States. It's really fascinating, and I thought this was a really good hook for this lesson because everyone knows about Disney. At Cal State Fullerton, our students obviously have ties to California. Even more locally, a lot of them have ties to Orange County and Disneyland. And this is something that they already knew. So it's also kind of like a nice way to, stimulate recall of what they already knew. But it's also a good way to get their attention. All right, so that's how I kicked off the lesson. Next off, I informed learners of objectives. My learners are novice instructional designers, so I did just kind of dryly list out the objectives, because when I teach instructional design, I kind of try to do I'm a little bit meta about it. I try to show them good practice by doing the good practice, to mixed results. I only have so much time, but this is what I did for them. And then again, I wanted to stimulate recall of prior learning. So step number 3. So it is a 2-week module, right? So with that introductory Adam Ruins Everything video, I kind of accomplished 2 things there. It was a good hook that gained attention, and was also kind of a good way to stimulate recall of prior learning. So even if they don't think they know anything about copyright, they know about Disney, and it can kind of like give them a little stimulation for what they do already know without even knowing they already know it. Yes, I know, very, very meta. But in week 2 of this 2-week lesson, I did have them stimulate recall of prior learning by having them do just a fun, no pressure, 10-question quiz on Creative Commons licenses. This was an ungraded quiz. It was just for fun, and was a way to kind of make sure that in the second week, they were retaining what they learned in the first week. So the first week, we did talk about Creative Commons. All right. For the content for both weeks, I just did YouTube videos and readings, and if they were interested, I offered links to further readings and resources. Again, we're talking about copyright and open multimedia. There's a lot out there that's free as far as videos and readings go, so I was able to use free content I found elsewhere on the web, and I offer them further links. So again, presenting the content is very straightforward. You just present the content. Here, I knew my goals were to have them practice finding and reusing open works and attributing Creative Commons works. So my learning guidance was kind of demonstrations and how-tos on how to find and reuse open works in week 1, and then I did demonstration of how to cite or attribute a Creative Commons work in week 2. So my learning guidance was kind of like, honestly, you could think of this also as a way of like an assignment explanation. You know, you're going to have them do a certain activity or assignment, and the learning guidance step is basically like talking your students through how they're going to do it, okay? You never just give an activity or an assignment completely blindly, and this is something they've done a million times before, like a spelling test or a worksheet. You need to give them some sort of guidance on how to accomplish the activity, so here's how I did that. All right, so steps 6 and 7 elicit performance and provide feedback. In week 1, I just had them explore open educational resources. I didn't give them feedback on that. These are graduate students, so I thought that having them go out and just explore this stuff is going to give them kind of the built-in feedback. They're just going out as exploration. It's open-ended. Week 2, I had them practice citing a given work. So I had a Creative Commons work that I posted, and I had them practice citing it. And on the next page of that lesson, I had them check their own works. This is kind of a self-guided activity. So this is a good practice activity that I didn't have to grade. Again, graduate students, they're responsible for their own learning, as works for me and my students. It might not work for yours, but you know, this also could be an activity where you have students practice something and then they, you know, pass off their paper to a peer, and their peer grades them and offers them feedback. You don't have to necessarily be the one providing feedback. I think that's really important to mention. They just have to receive some sort of feedback in the learning process. You don't have to be responsible for all of the learning. You just have to be responsible for the learning process. All right, so then the final activity, the final assess performance, where I make sure that they actually got it and are good to go. I did an asynchronous class discussion at the end of week 2. And what I did was I used the discussion format in our learning management system, and I had them do 3 posts. The first post, I had them take one of their own works that they created, like an essay or an infographic, and I had them put on a Creative Commons license and share it. Then I had them reply to a peer's post with an attribution statement of their work, and then I had them give feedback to their peers. So they replied to a peer's attribution statement with assessment of the accuracy and completion of the statement. So the idea here is that this is a relatively minor assignment in the larger course of my class. And I was able to build in peer feedback to this assignment. Of course, I went through the entire thing, the whole discussion, and made sure that everything was posted correctly and there's no misinformation shared. But this is really relatively simple assignment, and it made sense to give peer feedback. And this is a more interesting assignment for them. It wasn't just a straight discussion, because I tend to get sick of that in our online classes. This is a fun way to use the discussion format in my class. Okay. And then in the final step, enhance retention and transfer the job. Basically, later on in the class, I'm encouraging them to use Creative Commons licenses for their works and to submit them to open educational repositories. And, you know, some did. I thought that was really cool. So, again, this kind of harkens back to my overarching goal where I wanted them to see themselves as members of an open community. I also want them to use copyrighted materials responsibly. So this is kind of a good way to kind of like transition that. Again, this is kind of a class where we did a survey of a few topics, so it wasn't always a perfect segue to the next lesson, but this is a good way that I saw to wrap this up. Okay. So as a recap, again, these are the 9 events of instruction. I just gave you an example of how I put each of those into play in a 2-week lesson in my online class. So let's transition here to what you are working on. Let's talk about developing a lesson. So when it comes to your design strategy, you got to start by thinking about who your learners are, how will they learn. Of course, it varies how much control you're going to get over your own lessons, but you might choose different activities and content depending on maybe how much time you have to teach something. The format, obviously, is critical here. What constraints exist? I always kind of give the example of your students are using technology to take your course these days, right? Because they're doing a lot of online teaching, but their ability to use that technology well is going to vary. Their ability to pick up a new tool using that technology is going to vary. So it might be you have someone that's basically able to turn on the computer and that's it, and you might have someone else that can use whatever platform you're using very well and stay up and be ahead of the curve. So you got to think about those constraints when you choose, the technology tools that you want to put into practice for your learners as well. And then, of course, think about what your overarching goals are. And it's really critical to think about, again, not only constraints and the time allowed for the learning experience and the format, but what's attainable in the time you have. I often say that as an instructional designer, the work that I do is I provide the best solution possible for a given instructional problem with the resources, with the constraints, with the time that I have at hand. Given all the time and resources in the world, I'm going to make the most amazing lesson you've ever seen, but I live in the real world where there are constraints to meet for my learners. I've only got so much time to teach something. I've only got so much time to design and develop something, so I'm going to do the best I can with what I have. So please keep that in mind as you're trying to come up with a lesson. If you have perfectionist tendencies, I'm sure you already know that perfectionism is the enemy of done, so do the best you can with what you have, and you can always make tweaks in the future the next time you teach it. Alright, so that's your design strategy. When it comes to content, I just want to remind you, passive is okay because you're going to wrap around it with lots of interactivity and more engaging things. Consider your audience when it comes to content and give choice of format if possible. So again, especially in online learning, students can feel kind of powerless. They've been thrust into this thing that they don't really want to do, maybe they're not comfortable with. So it can be nice to give your students choices so that they can choose a format in which to learn in the way that they learn best. So for example, that might be if you have them I have actually some examples on the next slides, but it might be they might be able to read something instead of watching something, or maybe they can listen to something. It's just a choice of formats. You can do that for activities as well. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what that means and how to format your content. Again, passive is okay. If you are doing a lecture or a video, I do encourage you to kind of chunk it. If you can do the 10 and 2 rule, maybe no more than 10 minutes of passive content and 2 minutes of active. So that could just be in a lecture, you pause every 10 minutes and have your students reflect. It could be in a video, you just break up your videos into 10 minutes chunks and kind of do an activity for each 10-minute chunk. Your content format can just be a lecture, talking head, you're talking at your students, or a slide deck, that's fine. Again, it's okay to be passive. If you're teaching via Zoom and you want to share a video, I just want to note that there's an option in Zoom to optimize screen sharing for a video clip. It basically ups your bandwidth and make sure that your video doesn't come across as choppy. Just make sure to share your computer sound as well. So these are just some options if you're doing some live teaching online. Synchronous, these are some options and some guidelines for that kind of content. For asynchronous content, that means that what your learners are going to be kind of working through on their own. Videos, again, 10 and 2 rule. I would encourage you to make your videos 10 minutes or less. YouTube is fine. There's lots of stuff in LinkedIn Learning, depending if you're doing something subject-specific or technology-specific. If you are recording your lectures and presentations, break them into 10-minute chunks. A way to keep learners engaged during videos is to make interactive videos. There's a really neat technology called H5P. It's free. Just go to h5p.org. You can use it to layer interactive questions and links and content into online videos. So you could actually use any YouTube video, for example, or upload your own content, and you can make them into interactive experiences. That way your students are just zoning out during the video. They have to answer some questions. For readings, news articles, ebook chapters, journals, whatever you want to use for readings, textbook, of course, the world is your oyster. If you wanted to use audio, again, if you give choice of format to your students, that's fantastic. You can do selections from audiobooks or podcast episodes. If you want to do an interactive presentation, again, H5P is really, really cool. I want you to check it out so badly. But if you head over to h5p.org, they have a variety of formats for tutorials. One is called a course presentation. It's kind of like a PowerPoint that you can put interactive elements into. So you can use that to mix both your content and your interactives. It's a nice way to start building a lesson that your students can work through on their own. Okay. So I will show you a quick example of what H5P looks like. This is a course presentation I actually created to teach people about H5P, so forgive me for being a little bit meta. I did an online presentation to create interactive and accessible online tutorials with H5P. This was actually an asynchronous lesson. It was like a poster presentation, but I used H5P. In any case, ignore the content, but pay attention to how I used it. So you can have a variety of slides, and your slides can be a mix of static content. You can put links in as well and format it. You can put in images, and then you can sprinkle in all kinds of knowledge checks. So it's just a nice way for your learners to kind of check in, pause a minute, process what they have read. There's different formats for knowledge checks. You can do drag and drops as well as the multiple choice. And as your learner gets their score for each question, there actually is a final summary slide where they can see how they did throughout the entire lesson. Depending on your learning management system, you might also be able to get a plugin for H5P to talk to your learning management system, and they could use these as graded activities. Again, you can do images. You can also do drag and drops. Woo, I got it right. You can do flashcards, which I think is kind of fun. So they can kind of guess what the answer is. A different way to kind of present content using flashcards. You can have questions where you have to click on things, see if they get it right or not. And again, you can put in links, and there is a summary slide at the end so they can see how well they did. I did very well, except for the last question right there. So that's an example of an H5P course presentation. It's a lot of fun to use. Again, it's free. I encourage you to check it out. There's a lot of possibilities for creating engaging online lessons with that. All right. So I'd be remiss if I did a presentation on developing online lessons and not touch on copyright. So I don't want to stress you out more than you already are having to teach online, but I just want to point out that fair use, if you're familiar with the fair use doctrine, it's a defense, not a set of clear guidelines. So you've probably heard things like it's okay to use 10% of a book and not pay licensing as long as you're teaching for an educational context, nonprofit. But that's actually a myth when it comes to fair use. You'll hear a lot of guidelines that say it's okay to do certain things as long as you're teaching, but a lot of the time that's just kind of like wishful thinking. People are passing these things around because they want some sort of hard and fast guideline. But again, fair use is actually defense, not a set of clear guidelines. So I do have some strategies for making sure you're okay when using copyrighted content. It is always okay to link learners out to copyrighted content. Again, I know it depends on your audience. If you have small kids, you probably don't want to link to videos or use YouTube's embed feature. You probably want to find something more educational, but you could always use PBS or Khan Academy or something. It's okay to link out to those things. But in general, the original creator deserves clicks and ad revenue if you are using things that are supported by ads. And I also encourage you to provide links to things like news items, blogs, journal articles, ebooks. Generally, it's totally cool to summarize, but unless it's open content, openly licensed using Creative Commons, I recommend pointing learners to it or figuring out how to license it through your library or your school in some way. All right, I encourage you to browse OER repositories. These are repositories where there's tons of free content for teaching licensed under Creative Commons. If you want to reuse something that's licensed under Creative Commons, there are 4 simple steps. You just have to credit the creator, state the title of the work, list the license, and link back to the source. So here's an example. If I wanted to use this sound file, it's a doorbell sound file. I know it's a silly example. I list the title of the work. I say who created it. I don't know the person's actual name. That's okay. I'm going to put their username and the website I got it from. And I'm going to list the Creative Commons license. And then the title here is actually linked back to where I found it on the web. Okay. So let's go ahead and move on. So that's content. Again, content can be passive. That's totally fine. But try to do the 10 and 2 rule. Chunk your content. Give your learners an opportunity to reflect or maybe practice something with what they've learned. So let's talk about some tools for doing practice and assessment. Let's start with synchronous. So if you're doing some sort of live meeting by Zoom, here are some options for you. You can do polls. If you want to do an anonymous poll, you can do poll everywhere or Mentimeter. Zoom does have built-in polling, but you have to set it up in Zoom in advance, and it's kind of a pain. So personally, I prefer to use a third party like Poll Everywhere or Mentimeter, where it lives on that website, and then I just have to pull it up in my browser. So I just share my screen. It's really easy. Of course, you can use the chat box. You can use yes or no questions. You can do short answer questions. Again, if you're doing that 10 and 2, this is a good way to kind of check in with your learners, make sure they're still with you. You can use the raise hand feature in Zoom as well to do polling. You can just ask your learners, hey, just like in the class, raise your hand. If you've ever done this, put your hand down, things like that. You can run discussions. If you want to run a discussion in Zoom, try to moderate, summarize comments, help create a connecting thread between topics. A discussion could be by voice or it could be in the chat box. You can use breakout rooms in Zooms. Definitely visit those breakout rooms to check in. Maybe you can assign students, depending on the age of your students, to kind of moderate and guide discussion in each of their breakout rooms. If you want to keep everyone in a main screen, you can have them, you can annotate the screen, or you can have students annotate the screen to collect comments, kind of like a whiteboard in class, but you can turn on the annotation. Zoom does offer you the ability to annotate, so it's kind of fun to use. I recommend it. Padlet is a free online sort of corkboard. Just go to Padlet.com if you want to check it out. You can use it for brainstorming. You can also use it to ask learners to create or complete a task and prove completion by posting to Padlet. So it could be if you have your students doing some independent work, they can show you that they've done it successfully by posting something to Padlet. Let me show you a quick example of what this looks like. So this is a silly example. You can see how it gets silly really fast. I guess it's a good real world example. I did a presentation on my favorite apps for teaching in a presentation, and I asked my learners to post something that they like to use in teaching. And of course, they went a little crazy with Padlet. They found out that you can actually draw with your mouse. They figured out that you could put pictures in. So definitely you need to moderate these things. It's probably a good example of you can moderate your Padlet. You can delete the silly things. Oh yeah, someone found out that they could actually put a screenshot of themselves using their laptop camera, which is really funny. There are some serious people in here. You can see that they put in their favorite apps. This is a big group of adults I had when I did a free webinar online. So you can see people kind of were all over the place and what they really liked. But it's a good way to kind of show you how Padlet works. It's a good way to check in with my learners, see that they're still paying attention, and see that they were kind of on board and getting something out of my presentations. That was really nice. So again, I have used it in class or in live sessions by giving students a chance to work independently and then having them post something to Padlet. So basically you create the Padlet, you set it up, and then your learners can just double click on it to add whatever they want to their Padlet. You just have to make sure the privacy settings are correct. Lastly, if you haven't used Kahoot, I absolutely adore Kahoot. It's a game show style quiz where your learners can play independently, or you can play as a class where they just use a mobile device or a web browser and they answer questions to try to compete and earn points. And there's a leaderboard. It's super fun. I encourage you to use it. And a ton of teachers use it. So it's a really robust place to find existing quizzes that you can use for your own learners. Highly recommend. If you're doing an asynchronous lesson, you can still use Padlet, but turn on post moderation. So that means if someone posts to it, you have to approve it before it shows up. You could have a Kahoot again. Learners can play individually. I did a quick demo already of H5P, so you can have them work through interactive videos, course presentations, or even games. H5P is great. Please, please, please go check it out. For assignments, you can have them work through things like Adobe Spark. They could create quick multimedia presentations. Microsoft Sway is another good example of that. If you have older students, you could have them practice annotating web pages. You can actually create an entire course or class login basically, or a class space in Hypothesis. And so they can all see each other's annotations on a given web page. It's really fun. You do have to have a plugin for your browser. It's probably better with older students. Okay. So I know I talked pretty fast. Thanks for bearing with me this far. So now I'm going to talk about specific strategies and tips for very specific formats. So I talked generally about asynchronous and synchronous. Let's talk about specific formats that you might be teaching in. So if you are teaching webinars, this might be an outlandish piece of advice here, but I always recommend having a backup computer if you teach a webinar, especially if it's like a high-stakes webinar. You can also use your phone if you're using Zoom, so you could have your laptop going and Zoom going on your phone as well. It's really nice to see how your presentation looks to your students. You can also jump over quickly if your computer crashes, and in general, use a headset with a microphone for the best possible audio. If you use a headset, it's going to cut down on any sort of ambient noise that's going on behind you. For webinars, do turn your camera on if you can. In some platforms, this increases bandwidth too much and it can actually be an issue. But it's nice if you can turn your camera on because it does humanize yourself as a presenter. You can see in this presentation, I've not turned my camera on. I apologize for that. So I'm not practicing what I preach here. But generally, I do like to use my camera so I can show up as a real person in the webinar. And this might be a weird tip, but if you look at the camera, it feels like eye contact for your learners, and this actually applies to videos as well. And finally, for webinars, keep an eye on the chat. If you can have a moderator help you out, that'd be really wonderful. Or maybe you can even assign a student to kind of collect questions as they come through to make sure that you are catching all those questions. But it is a better learning experience to answer questions as they come up in context. Next up, let's talk quickly about slide decks and videos. When it comes to narration for recorded videos or even for webinars, in general, don't read your slides. Do you see what I did there? I just read my slides. But if you have a lot of text on a screen, people read faster than you talk. You already read this before I said it aloud to you. Furthermore, people learn better when there's less redundancy. If you're curious about to learn more about this, look up the redundancy principle from Meyer's 12 Principles of Multimedia Learning. Oops. Don't read a script unless you can make it sound natural. There are reasons to read a script. If you read a script because you want to be able to pop in the script to YouTube to create captions, or you'll make captions out of your video, that's a good reason to read a script, but in general, make it sound natural as possible. Incredibly, casual speech can be more engaging than reading a script. Some ums and ahs actually help learners learn more. I think it's just because you sound more human and they're kind of paying more attention. When it comes to visuals for slide decks and videos, I recommend using bullet points and simple visuals. I mean, you need to have something on screen so that learners can kind of start organizing the stuff in their minds. So we talked a lot about, GAGNE'S 9 events. We want to connect new information to existing information. It can help people make kind of a mental schema of what it is you're teaching if you have something on screen, just something really simple. Do avoid animations unless necessary. When in doubt, fade in and out. Animations can be very distracting, especially if someone's got a learning disability. It can also kind of distract from your message as well. I already mentioned this, bears repeating again. Look at the camera, make eye contact with your learner, especially if you're recording a video where it's just you talking. It feels more personal and like you have more of a presence if you are making eye contact with your learner. It might feel weird and inauthentic, but it does make a difference for your learners, I promise. Okay, so when it comes to slide decks and videos, keep it simple. I do a ton of presentations. I use PowerPoint basically exclusively. I mean, it gets the job done. It creates shareable files. Pretty much everyone connected to online learning has the Microsoft Office suite, so I know they'll be able to use a PowerPoint file. I know if someone's using a Mac, even if they don't have Office, I know that their software that comes with the whole Mac experience will be able to read PowerPoint, so it works well. I have used Google Slides in the past. It can corrupt more easily if it's converted back and forth. Really cool though, Google Slides does offer live captioning. So if you're doing a presentation in Google Slides and you have live captioning turned on, it'll actually provide on-screen captions as you are presenting. However, those results can vary. So I'd like to give you a quick example of what that looks like to use Google Slides and have the captions turned on. So this is Google Slides. It's just a dummy presentation. I'm going to do a oops, there's the present. So you have to go down here and turn on captions. And then you just start talking. And as you talk, these captions appear at the bottom of your screen. It's actually doing pretty well so far. I'm pretty impressed by it. But you'll see that there's a complete lack of punctuation in these captions. I think they are actually a little bit higher quality than the YouTube captions. If you upload a video to YouTube, it'll automatically caption it, but it tends to be all over the place as far as the words it chooses. But yeah, I'm impressed by this so far. It does. I think it saves these as well, so you can reuse them later on. But the lack of punctuation is a big problem. So if you wanted to meet accessibility guidelines and comply with 508. Section 508. These aren't going to be high quality enough captions to meet that bar. We could always go back and fix the captions. I do like too that you notice it's not including my filler words, my ums and ahs, my arms and ahs. So that's kind of nice that it doesn't do the filler words, and also I like that it did caption my haha right there when I laughed. So very entertaining. I could do this all day, but you are not here to watch me do that all day. So let's go ahead and move on. All right. So back to this. When you're doing a slide deck, I do recommend using the built-in layouts in PowerPoint or Google Slides for consistent look and feel. You can customize them going to master slides. That's a little trick that a lot of people don't know about. Oops. I keep bumping my mouse, so I apologize. But you can change the look for all of your slides by going to Master Slide. If you use the built-in layouts, you can also make changes after the fact to the look and feel of your presentation, and it'll make those changes universally and flawlessly. So that's a really nice perk to use Master Slides. Okay. Moving right along here, my last content slide here for you is for online tutorials or courses. In general, for lessons, chunk your content. If you're doing something like a course presentation in H5P where the learner is supposed to be clicking through the experience, use headings and opt for less content per page or slide. Don't hesitate to break up content. No one's charging you by the pixel in online learning, so go ahead and go crazy using those pixels. I mean, make things usable by breaking them up. It's okay to have white space, avoid walls of text, that kind of thing. Do keep your navigation clear and consistent. If you have something where learners are clicking through, again, controls should be identical visually and they should be in the same location on each page. And finally, I encourage you to include progress indicators. Set expectations for your learners. How long will a course take to complete? Number your quiz questions. No one ever wants to take a quiz or a survey and the questions just seem to go on forever and they don't know how long it's going to take. They don't know where they are. So number your questions. Tell them how many there's going to be. Set expectations from the very beginning. Above all, remember that it won't be perfect. Perfectionism is the enemy of done. There's no one right way. There's no perfect way to develop a learning experience. There's a lot of different ways to still be an effective educator online. And again, you're probably going to end up teaching the same thing multiple times, just like you probably teach the same subject over many years. So you can always start off with a draft of how you want your lesson or course to go. And then the next time you teach it, you can always make further tweaks later on. So just keep that in mind as you develop your learning experiences. Do the best you can with what you have and the time you have. And in the future, you can always make updates later on. Just take notes as you teach it. and then later on refer to those notes and make those improvements when you can. So that's it. Thank you so much for joining me in this presentation. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to listen to me ramble on about strategies for developing online learning. I've been teaching online for several years. I think it's a lot of fun. I think it does have a lot of challenges. In some ways, it's a lot better than teaching online. In other ways, it's worse. There's pros and cons to online and to in person. And you just got to consider the format and do the best that you can with what you have. Again, thanks so much for joining me. I hope you have a great rest of your day.